Mark Van Vleck, Assistant City Manager. Joining me today will be Christy Shaw from HDR, who will address the changes to demands that were suggested during the last briefing. Ray Allen from Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries, who will address the history, benefits, and science behind freshwater inflows that are so critical to the health of the estuary. And then we have Rocky Front from Nueces River Authority, who will be addressing the current environmental flow requirements and how they are calculated. And so if you can hold your questions on our requirements until you get to Rocky, that will be helpful. We went through a trial run here, and poor Ray ended up trying to say, well, Rocky will answer that, Rocky will answer that. So if I can beg your indulgence there. I also want to introduce two other people who are joining us that can also, we have Laura J. Francis, okay, who is the new Water Resource Project Manager, the new Brent, for those that remember Brent when he was here. He's now been here for a full week.
Oh, wow. Tell us your name again.
Actually, he pardon?
I'm sorry, what was his name again?
Laura J., and if you have trouble with that, he answers to LJ.
Okay.
LJ Francis. And he's here, and also we have Bill Green, Major Projects Engineer, who's kind of been helping us out in the water supply area until LJ got here, and now we're going through a turnover right now in that process. Okay. Just a reminder, we're still in the discovery or informational portion of this discussion. This is the schedule that we were following. We had originally planned to bring you a discussion on current supplies today, but the information from the Texas Water Development Board that is needed to update our model were delayed. We've now scheduled that presentation for September 27th. Up now will be Christy Shaw of HDR, who is also the consultant that provides assistance to Region N for the state water planning process. Christy.
Mayor, council members, it's good to see you today. Thank you for the opportunity to come and to follow up on the presentation that I made back in July with respect to the water demand scenarios. At that time, I made a presentation sharing with you two different demand scenarios. One of them was based on the Texas Water Development Board projections and as included in the Region N plan. And then the second scenario took a look at the current industrial projections, which because of some changes over the last few years, some of the anticipated industrial new customers that were anticipated to be brought online by 2020, those were re-indexed essentially based on current conditions. And so those two scenarios were brought together for consideration during the last meeting back on July 19th. And at that time, there were some comments and some questions about a third scenario. So today, I'm here to share with you the results of that third scenario, which was based on Dr. Lee's reporting and Texas A&M Corpus Christi, which has looked at projecting population growth in the Corpus Christi and surrounding area. So I reached out to Dr. Lee. He was very gracious and supportive of providing information for this analysis. And his studies have focused on looking at what the projected trends are in population growth. And what he has seen through his research is that a projected trend of a 1% increase in population annually is appropriate for the area. So that information was based on, he presented some information up to 2015 that had substantiated that 1% growth rate. And I was able to get information for some of the other surrounding areas, the municipalities in the Corpus Christi area that weren't explicitly included in his studies. And we looked back at 2011 and found a commonality there, and looked at the 2011 population for the city of Corpus Christi, and then also looked at the 2011 population provided by the Texas Water Development Board through their per capita rate report. There's information that is provided from most municipal entities throughout Texas to the Water Development Board on an annual basis. And that information includes population, and also per capita rates. So we were able to get a baseline for 2011 for all the municipal entities that the City of Corpus Christi provides water to directly or indirectly. And then we applied that 1% per capita rate out into 2070. And then based on the per capita consumption for 2011, we were able to calculate these water demands. And that was used in projecting this new third demand scenario that's based on a population growth of 1%. So when you look at this as broken down by category, the main distinction here as compared to the previous scenarios is with respect to the municipal demand. As you may recall, during the previous presentation on the 19th of July, the municipal demand projection was fairly constant out into 2070. And with this new scenario, you'll see the increases that are shown for the municipal sector. For the industries, it remained the same. So what we did is we used the same industrial projection that was previously done for scenario 2. Now, what does this look like when comparing all three scenarios? Up until about 2040, there's not much of a difference between scenario 2 and scenario 3. And mainly that is because the Texas Water Development Board and other projections that were used for the municipal sector, it had reflected a very similar growth rate as that 1%. But the difference really you see after 2040, and the green line starts shooting up and projecting to be greater than the other two scenarios. And that is attributed solely to this projection of a 1% annual growth continuing out into 2070. And this is a more conservative analysis. It also looks at the per capita rate back in 2011, and it keeps that constant. So it doesn't reflect really any kind of aggressive conservation measures in the future, but for a planning estimate, it's good to be on the safe side, so it's a more conservative approach. So out in 2070, the difference is roughly about 25 or 30,000 acre feet a year that would be shown as greater in the scenario 3 as compared to scenario 2.
So this is based on the per capita usage in 2011.
Correct.
And then we had that 1 year where we reduced total consumption by 14%. 18, what? 15%? All right, so there was a big drop. But so, and I don't remember if that was that total consumption, was that per capita? That's what I thought. So it's per capita reduction of, let's just say 15% is not reflected, and that's why you say this is a conservative number, that the actual demand using the current per capita usage would probably be lower than this line.
Most likely. And in the estimates that the Texas Water Development Board uses for regional planning, it typically shows a lower per capita demand over time. And that's because presumably when there's new construction that comes online, that they have the Plumbing Code Fixture Act incorporated in that, and there's just a built-in conservation that occurs. So that gets translated on the per capita level. But interestingly enough, the best way for us to, or the best approach to be able to compare the City of Corpus Christi with some of the other municipal customers here in the area was to look back at 2011, because that was the most current overlap period with the Dr. Lee study. And we looked at that growth and that projected municipal growth rate for each of the entities and then summed that up.
Okay.
So mine is short and sweet.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Christy. There's some acronyms that are relevant to the presentation that will follow. And I'm not going to hit all of these, but I think it's worth highlighting the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. As you read many of the documents, that particular organization has changed its name. This is the third change. It was originally the Texas Water Commission. Okay, so you'll see some documents that will say, on the permits, that will say Texas Water Commission granted it, or go back to the commission. That was followed by the Texas Natural Resources and Conservation Commission, okay, which those have now are under the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So when you're reading those older documents, just realize today those are the TCEQ. And the last one that I want to discuss is the NEAC. And how many of you have heard of the NEAC before? Okay. The key is it's the Nueces Estuary Advisory Council. This organization has been in place since 1992 and is tasked with monitoring the implementation of the order, recommending any changes to the order, and establishment of future operating procedures. It's made up of state agencies and several other stakeholders. The agreed order establishes the membership, and today we have 3 of the members, Ray Allen, Rocky, and Bill Green are members of that council. Okay. I think it's critical at this point to remind you that the state of Texas owns all surface water in the state. Okay, so you can build a lake or a dam, but the water that goes into the dam is still the property of the state. They use a permitting process to grant entities the right to use that water. Okay. It is not uncommon for them to place conditions on the use of that water. Note that the original and all subsequent permits that we're going to be going through talk about the need for 151,000 acre-feet of inflows. As we go through this briefing, you will see reference to 138,000 acre-feet. The difference is made up by return flows into the estuary from discharges associated with wastewater treatment plants and other discharge permits granted by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Since the original permit, there have been several revisions. Any suggested changes must have the unanimous consent of the 3 certificate holders, and the key is there's actually 3 of us that own the certificate for Choke Canyon. The City of Corpus Christi, the Nueces River Authority, and the City of Three Rivers. The last change requested was in 2001. And then the final thing on 2007, Senate Bill 3 was passed. During this presentation, we'll briefly describe that process that created that law. It's listed here because it also looked at environmental flows into the Nueces Estuary. So there have been numerous studies, but one was actually sanctioned by the state and funded by the state, and that was under Senate Bill 3. Okay. I'll now turn it over to Ray Allen, the Executive Director of Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries, who will discuss why freshwater flows are important. And again, he will be followed by Rocky, who will talk about the requirements of the current agreed order. Ray?
Thank you, Mark. Mayor, council members, thank you. If I get my arrows located here. As Mark said, water rights were granted to the city of Corpus Christi, not ownership, but water rights. And at that time, this was some 40 years plus ago, when the water rights were issued in 1976, that even then the issue of freshwater inflows to the bays was recognized as a critical issue to be dealt with, necessary to maintain a healthy and productive bay system. That's an important reminder here. So let's get a little orientation here. The Nueces River and the Nueces Estuary here. We all know the river, Choke Canyon Reservoir comes down through there, hits Lake Corpus Christi, comes on down the river to the saltwater barrier there on the Nueces River, just at Labonte Park. And so the estuary effectively starts below the saltwater barrier, because an estuary is where fresh water from the land meets the saltwater from the ocean and they mix, and that's important. So we have the estuary, that part of the lower stretch of the Nueces River. The Nueces River Delta, the kind of that heart of the estuary where all those important wetlands and great biologically productive areas are, and that's a reason for a focus in the agreed order that Rocky will talk about. But then also those flows continue to mix into Nueces Bay and even into Corpus Christi Bay before finally the waters eventually reach the Gulf of Mexico. So you have this big comprehensive estuarine system, if you will. If you look at the agreed order, as Rocky will do, you'll see that the emphasis is more on the back part of Nueces Bay and on the Nueces River Delta, where the river comes immediately into the bay system, because that's the most important part of the estuary. So let me keep moving through here. You already know this. We live in a semi-arid area. It's drier to our west, wetter to our east. Our pipelines, the Mary Roads pipeline, runs to the east to Lake Texana and then onto the Colorado. They have water over there. That's why we don't build pipelines out west. In fact, our watershed itself is further west than Corpus Christi and out in a very dry part of the region. So inflows are flashy, water supplies are limited at times, and droughts are to be expected from time to time. History of the reservoirs, again, just a little backup info here. 1930, La Fruta Dam at Lake Lovenskold, and I'm told that Lovenskold was a mayor at one point. Anybody remember him? No, me neither.
It used to be a park that I think we closed down.
That's right.
Right next here to City Hall.
Exactly.
On the other side of Antelope.
1935 Mathis Dam. That was expanded in 1958 with the Wesley Seal Dam. Now we're getting into where some of us should know about some of this. The formation of a bigger Lake Corpus Christi. Then in 1982, the water rights Choke Canyon Reservoir was completed. The permits were in the 70s. The construction was finished in the 80s for Choke Canyon Reservoir. So those are the changes we've seen in the river systems and have affected things. So let's talk changes in freshwater inflows. Honestly, you can't build reservoirs without affecting downstream. And that's what the requirements in the water rights permits are all about, is trying to mitigate some of those downstream impacts and in condition 5B relating to the bay and estuary health. So we've already seen mean river flows into Nueces Bay reduced by 47% on average. We still continue to have freaky big floods at times, but on average years overall, we've seen a 40% to 47% decline in river flows.
And that's over from 83 to today?
83 to 2015. We're still digging up a few years of data to figure out. But yeah, so 83 is the key there for when Choke Canyon was built. And so we've seen those inflows. Just as important, perhaps, is to the right, you see these mean river flows into the upper Nueces Delta. Reservoirs capture flood flows. That's what they do. Well, once we capture those flood flows, they quit flooding downstream as much, and the marshes and wetlands of the Nueces River Delta don't receive those flooding events, those inundation events that would drive the biology and maintain the habitats in that area. And that's why we have moved water around, try to get water where it's most needed. So you can see, in fact, it's like a 94% reduction in flows through the delta. Water just stays in the river channel. It takes a big flood event now, which are moderated by the reservoirs, to really get out of its riverbank and flood across the river delta. It's moderated flooding, so there's less damage, that's for sure. We keep moving on here. Talk about the benefits of freshwater inflows, healthy bays, healthy economy, quality of life. Dr. Lee, he's a very popular guy, did studies looking at nature tourism and visitorship to the area. Healthy bays, good health systems are important for the tourist industry, but hey, I live here. It's about quality of life for people who reside here, and having a healthy and productive bay is important overall. So yeah, there's commercial species and recreational important species, but we all like the birds, the fish, and everything about the bay, keeping it healthy. So that's important. Dr. Lee did some good work there looking at some numbers. Let's talk about the science here. State law talks about environmental flows. What's the point? What's the purpose? Trying to maintain a schedule of flow quantities that are adequate to support a sound ecological environment. This is what environmental flows are about. This is why the state preserved water to go to Nueces Bay, to try to have that sound ecological environment out there so that some vestige of the natural productivity is preserved in perpetuity. Let's look at specifics. The purpose of that is to sustain the full complement of native species in perpetuity. Not just the important species that we catch on our rods and reels, but all the species out there, because that's the way the ecosystem works. Sustains those key habitats where we're talking about marshes, intertidal mudflats, we're talking about oyster reefs, and various kind of other habitats in our bay systems that require those freshwater inflows to be healthy and productive. Finally, also, we need those natural flow regimes, and this is critical. And when we get to the discussion about the agreed order, you'll see there's a seasonal or monthly pattern. Getting the water at the right time is critical for the biology. We have a system here that's adapted to both spring inflow events and big fall, hurricane kind of events, and so the biology sort of depends on that. So the system we have in place now through the agreed order mimics that natural system to provide freshwater inflows when they're needed and where they're needed in that part of Nueces Bay. What do freshwater inflows do? It creates that salinity gradient. These animals all have preferences for where they want to be, what kind of habitats they want to be in. River flows provide that into the bay and establishing those salinity gradients so that you not only have very low salinities, but as it works its way towards the Gulf, the salinities start to increase, and the animals can self-select for where they are going to do best in their life cycle. And this is important because not only do the rivers deliver those salinities, they deliver the nutrients needed to drive the productivity of the system. So that all goes into play there. What species are important? There's a lot of important species. Finding some that are important and there's good data on to look at to understand the ecosystem and what's required. You can look at the habitats of smooth cordgrass, the different species of oysters and crabs and croakers, etc. These are more estuarine-dependent species, require lower salinity waters at some point in their lifetime, and this is critical. A lot of these adult organisms are more tolerant of higher salinities, but in their larval and juvenile stages, they require lower salinities to have greater survival rates, and that's important. And so the studies that have been done, especially this is from the expert science team report under SB3, started looking at those species and their salinity needs, and you can see here the recommendation of an 18 parts per thousand, and remember ocean water is 32, 34 parts per thousand. So the Senate Bill 3 process. In 2007, the legislature passed Senate Bill 3, required the state agencies to look at environmental flows, not just to the bay, but in the rivers. And so, and not just in the Nueces system either, but all across the state. So there was a whole series of efforts by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, Texas Water Development Board, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and most importantly, community stakeholders who were involved and scientists from universities. And they looked at the conditions of the bays. In our case here, they found that Nueces Bay failed to meet the definition of a sound ecological environment. Now, the inflows we talked about had already been reduced. There were other impacts. There had been pollutants added to Nueces Bay. There had been shell dredging historically. There's been a lot that's gone on out there. So, these things have occurred over time, but all along the Texas coast, only the Nueces Bay system was found by the scientists to not meet this definition of a sound ecological environment. Doesn't mean we just walk away from it. We got to do the best we can with what water is still left to manage. And that's been the focus of the studies. And so since the agreed order in 1990s time frame, there's been a number of studies. The city of Corpus Christi has paid for a lot of those studies. The state agencies, the estuary program, a lot of folks have been involved, the river authority. We've all had a hand in looking at different components of what the environmental flow needs are. You know, how important are flows in January versus in April? How much quantity, what quantity of water do we need to meet the salinity targets? And salinity is a good surrogate for, you know, the health of the system or meeting the environmental conditions you need there. If you can get the salinities right, the biology kind of take care of itself. You know, and you can't really manage that anyway, but if you can get the conditions where they need to be, you know, the chances of a good, healthy, productive system are greatly improved. But we've had lots of studies out there. We've looked at inflows, we've looked at biological responses, we've looked at seasonal patterns, we've looked at monthly patterns, biological responses. We've looked at moving water around, you know, with the agreed order, the waters are moved into the Rincon Bayou, which flows directly through the middle of the Nueces River Delta. And that's been tremendously helpful, and it took a smaller amount of water. If you had to make a flood in the Nueces Bay and push water back, it just takes a lot of water. But if you can move smaller quantities to where you need them, that's very helpful and really helps drive the productivity. A lot of studies have been completed. There's an awful lot of shelf art out there. If you want to read that, we can get that to you. The Bay and Basin Expert Science Team reports are published. Some studies are still ongoing. We continue to have questions about how best to manage the water. But I would tell you at this point, looking at the quantities involved, looking at the seasonal patterns, we're now down to fine tuning. There's not going to be any, in my opinion, there aren't going to be any big changes in how much is needed or when to put it in there. It's, you know, we have a system now that functions on a monthly calendar because the computer models that were used to calculate ecological needs ran in 1 month steps. You know, the organisms out there, they don't have a calendar. They know seasons. They know solar periods. They know water temperatures. That does correspond to calendars, but, you know, so there's a little flexibility in there. There are opportunities as we go forward through the Nueces Estuary Advisory Council to look at making changes, but again, I think those are going to be on the level of making minor adjustments and not wholesale changes. Just not going to happen. So, with that, a couple key points here. You know, a healthy Nueces Estuary requires freshwater inflows. Other systems, river systems, and even lakes, reservoirs have pass-through requirements, have inflows downstream. So nothing special here about our system. I would tell you, though, that back in the 70s, this was somewhat new and something that the state had wanted to do, and now is standard practice for them to look at downstream impacts and bay and estuary inflow needs. Again, the BBES found the system did not meet the definition of a sound ecological environment. That's just a challenge for us. Fortunately, that study had no retroactive provisions here, so, you know, the city's water rights are secured with no changes. The pass-through requirements were not affected by that finding. And finally, those inflow studies and biological studies have been done. There's still some that are ongoing. You know, if you've ever done work with universities, you know, the first recommendation is always to do more studies. And so there are still needs out there, but again, it's back to fine tuning. So I think that's kind of where I had it wrapped up. I want to introduce Rocky Friend now from the Nueces River Authority. I hope everyone has a calculator. So thank you.
Thank you, Ray.
We'll be here for questions.
And NEAC does a lot of great work. Enjoyed being with you all last week.
Down. Okay. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council, Mrs. Rose. As Ray pointed out, our watershed for our water supply is west of Corpus Christi, out in the desert area. This graphic shows the entire watershed of the Nueces Basin. A subset of that is in the green, which is the Frio River Basin, and that is what feeds Choke Canyon Reservoir. And as Mrs. Rose stated earlier this morning, that we're getting a lot of inflow into Choke Canyon right now, which is a good thing. It doesn't happen very often.
Oh, I know.
And as you know from the Region M planning, these two reservoirs are operated as a system to maximize our water supply. Lake Corpus Christi is the most downstream system. It is, has a larger watershed. It's more likely to fill in the event of a rain event. Choke Canyon, on the other hand, is a larger, deeper, cooler reservoir. Its relative evaporation rate is less than that at Lake Corpus Christi. So it is a better storage unit for water. And so for these reasons, our water use, the pass-through requirements, all come out of Lake Corpus Christi. So what is the pass-through? Very simplistically, what measured inflow into the reservoir system up to a target amount is required to be passed through to the bays and estuaries. Now, in this sense, target is the maximum requirement under the agreed order. There's no release from storage to meet that target. For example, if the target is 5,000 acre feet, 2,000 acre feet is measured inflow to the reservoirs, 2,000 goes out. Another 3,000 does not have to be released from storage to meet that 5,000 acre foot target.
So how do you get to that minimum again? How did you net that out to get to that minimum of 2,000?
Okay, so if the pass-through requirement is the lesser of that target amount or the measured inflow into the reservoir system.
Okay, now I'm with you.
Okay. So how were the targets determined? They vary by month based on historic flow, as Ray mentioned, and it's also based on the current capacity of the reservoirs, the percent of total capacity. And there's also a salinity relief credit that can reduce the target amount, and I'll go into that in a little more detail in a little bit. But those are the two things that determine what the target is. So on this graph, if the combined volume of the reservoir system is below 30%, there is no required pass-through. If it's between 30 and 40, it's 1,200 acre feet each month, and that's that blue line at the bottom, the blue column. And the red hash mark is the volumes required between 40 and 70% when the lakes are between those. And then greater than 70% is the green portion. So it's a little bit higher. If the lakes are fuller, the pass-through requirements, the pass-through targets are higher. And if you notice, there's a few months, January through April and in December, that there's no additional green on top. That is because that's the same target, whether it's greater than 40% or greater than 70%. And then you can see in May and June, September, October, those are our high historic inflow months, and so the targets are higher, trying to get the fresh water to the bay.
You know, it'd be helpful for future reference is to put annual targets related to combined systems, water systems.
The agreed order is just these, refers to these reservoirs.
Right.
Right.
I guess if you go to the back, your prior slide, it would be good to have our reservoirs up there to understand that they're on our, as far as our reservoirs combined, as far as lake levels.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
yes, I think I'm getting there.
Okay. Well, for this one, I guess what I'm saying, if I ever look back at this, you know, that will be helpful to reference back to that.
Okay, this is where Ray was referring to the calculator. And I'm going to try to do the drawing on here. Like I said, the target is based on the measured inflow into the reservoir system. There are two ways that this is calculated. And I want to point out that this, let's try this. This station here, Nueces River at, the lower one. In our NTRT, Nueces River at Three Rivers. It's the most downstream gauge, and these are the gauges that are monitored or maintained by the USGS. And it contains the flows from the Atascosa River at Witsit and the Nueces River at Tilden, the lower one on the Nueces, and also the release from Choke Canyon. So the preferred calculation takes the flow at the Nueces River at Three Rivers, adds to it what comes in to Choke Canyon via San Miguel Creek and the Frio River at Tilden, and subtracts what's coming out of the lake. And so
and
that's
who keeps up with all that? You do?
Yeah.
Okay. Nueces River Authority.
Every once in a while, that value is less than 0. Mm-hmm. So when that happens, the calculation is the outer 4 gauges. So the preferred one is the first one, and then every once in a while we will see this happen. Okay. And this will all come into play when I go through the pass-through report itself. We get a lot of questions regarding, how are things working, and why things work the way they do. And one question is, what happens if it rains below Lake Corpus Christi? Does that count? Any water that either flows over the saltwater barrier dam at Labonte Park or is pumped through the Rincon Pipe Station into the Delta counts towards the pass-through requirement. So if it rains like crazy below the lake, then that all counts. Nothing has to be passed through, let out of the dam. Occasionally, more than is required goes into the bays and estuaries, and the city can take up to half of the next month's target as a surplus. So it will carry forward if more than necessary goes over. And the city also receives a 500 acre-foot return flow credit from wastewater returns every month that goes towards the pass-through requirement. So in a little bit, when I talk about required pass-throughs, that takes off that 500 because that does not have to come out of the reservoir system. Okay. When we get a lot of rain over the bay, like we're getting this morning, how does that, how do the salinity levels play into it? If the salinity levels at the official monitoring site, which is near where the mouth of the river goes into the bay, meet specific criteria, and again, these vary by month, there's a lot of moving parts, then a salinity relief credit can be taken and it reduces the target amount. This actually happened recently last month. The average salinity for 10 consecutive days, which is one of those criteria, was below 15 parts per thousand, and so the target was reduced by 50%. In March, the average salinity for 10 consecutive days was below 25 parts per thousand, and the target was reduced by 25%. So again, these are moving target. It varies by month and by level. And I did want to make a point that the city can either take the salinity relief credit or the surplus from a previous month, but not both in the same month. Okay, there's a lot of detail on here, but I get asked a lot, has the city ever gotten a salinity relief credit? Yes. At 9 out of the last 15 years, there's been at least 1 month where there was a salinity relief credit. And like I said, there's a lot of different variables in here, but where you see colored columns for these years, there were salinity relief credits were taken. And I want you to notice here in 2004, over 100,000 acre-feet salinity relief credit was realized by the city. They were able to use that. And that's going to be coming to play in the next slide. So now we have all these targets. What has actually happened? And I'll explain this chart. The solid line at the top is the reservoir trace, if you will. That's percent of capacity that scales over on the right-hand side on January 1st of each year. There's a lot more variation in there, but that's where it was on January 1st of each year. 2007 was a very wet year. The reservoirs filled, and so that's the 1 year in this time period that the total targets were 138,000 for the year. And the way the blue is the target, and then the red bars are the inflow, the required pass-through, basically the inflow into the reservoir system. And these are monthly totals for, what was required in January, February, March, April, each of those years. So as you can see, in 2007, it was a wet year. We had a lot of inflow, and so the following year, the reservoirs were above 70%, so the maximum targets were in play. But it was also a drier year, and the actual inflow was a lot less, and so the pass-through requirements were a lot less. You can see in 2013, the targets are very low. That's when the lakes got real low. And the difference here is on 2004, I talked about on the last slide, the salinity relief credits. That's, even though the lakes are full, there was the targets were small because of the salinity relief credits.
Yeah, everyone's going to have a test after this.
Now, there's a lot of voiced concerns that the pass-throughs are causing Lake Corpus Christi to go down. Over these 15 years, what I call is our total water use. The blue part of that graph is the human use. That's what we use to water our lawn, flush our toilets, supply industry. The green hash is the evaporation measured at Lake Corpus Christi and Choke Canyon Reservoir. It doesn't include evaporation in the rivers themselves or any kind of channel loss. And then the smallest part of these bars are the red bars at the top is the pass-through requirement.
Interesting. So mostly drought related.
Yeah. So if you look at, again, 2007, it was a wet year, so our human consumption was less, the evaporation was less, and the pass-throughs were higher because we were getting more rain. 2011, water use, human use was very high, evaporation was high, but the pass-through requirements were very, very low. And then when you add all these up together, our human use for our total water use, and this is just out of Lake Corpus Christi and Choke Canyon, it doesn't include Texana, is 26%. 62% is lost to evaporation, and only 12% it goes through the required pass-throughs.
That's interesting. So we get these questions all the time, especially I bet you in the Northwest area you get a lot as far as on the water releases. But we just had we get them all the time through the city in our email. So we can say that for the last 14 years that what has reduced lake levels with respect to the pass-throughs is only 12%.
That's correct.
Golly, I just want this one slide. Yeah, drought, evaporation.
Yes.
Is 62%.
Put ping pong balls on the lake. Okay, so. Okay, now
it's just money. We were talking about. I have to say this because it's been still on my mind about changing, a paradigm shift with our operational and maintenance. It would be lovely to have, no problem as far as our resources are concerned. But even, anyway, just trying to get to half of a backlog is mind-boggling. Anyway, but this 12% puts things in perspective, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right, yeah. So yes, it is not the pass-throughs that are draining Lake Corpus Christi.
That's the message there.
Okay. All right, now on to the pass-through report. And actually this is more than, we call it the pass-through report. It has a whole lot of information on it. And I understand that y'all receive this every day, every Friday. It's generated every day. You can get it every day if you want it. But I'm going to walk through the report and so and show you all the parts of it. The top part is kind of the reservoir statistics. And on this report, we also include information about Lake Texana and the soon-to-be Colorado River data so that everything's all in one place. But for the reservoirs, this top section here, there we go, it shows when the reservoirs are full, what the numbers are in feet above mean sea level, volume, acre feet of volume. The highlighted bar there is the morning's report. Now, as you know, it takes time to get presentations ready for council, so this was the last day before we got to put this presentation together. So this is as of the August 22nd report. So that the gray line shows you what was the the information that morning. And then the next line down is the day before, and then a month before, and then the year before. Just kind of so you can kind of see how the reservoirs are going. And then the next set of part of that is the Texana, the water we're getting from Texana. And then soon to be the Colorado River water supply. I understand it's undergoing testing, and we're working out a few logistics, but that'll start showing up on the report here pretty soon.
So if I understood Mrs. Rose correctly, that the Choke Canyon Reservoir is 8% higher than the 37.9 today.
Well, see, that was, I think you were probably looking at this morning's report. Yes, I do have this morning's report. It was at 43.7% this morning.
Okay, kind of close to that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then we also include weather-related information for Lake Corpus Christi and Choke Canyon. The maximum air temperature from the day before, evaporation, and rainfall. We have month-to-date and year-to-date totals for evaporation and rainfall at each individual reservoir, and then combined evaporation month-to-date and year-to-date for those two reservoirs. The next section on the report are the stream flow gauges, and these are all that map I showed you with all the acronyms on it. And this is what is used to compute the inflow into the reservoir system. On this day, the first the preferred calculation took place and showed that on that day, on the day before, that 83 45 acre feet was measured inflow into the reservoir system, for a month-to-date total of just over 17,000 acre feet. That's not included in any calculation. We've added Colorado in here just for informational purposes. It flows. Okay, so now to the actual pass-through requirement. As I said, the requirement is the lesser of the reservoir inflow or the target. So in this month, the target is 5,000. We had 905 acre feet of surplus inflow to the estuary in July. Take the 500 return flow credit, and as of this day, 1,826 acre feet had been measured flowing either over the saltwater barrier dam or through the Rincon pipeline. So as of this day, there was still 1,769 acre feet of water left to be passed through. And so this gets updated every single day.
Mr. Scott?
I want to go while we're here. So we're showing the Colorado, and it says there's 75,000 acre feet have flowed this month, or what?
Yes, past that gauge up there.
And how would we know how much of that could be ours? Does it matter? Because we own, what, 35,000 acre feet?
Right, and that will be reported here when we start getting that information in on a daily basis.
Through the pipeline phase 2.
Pipeline phase 2, yes, ma'am.
But so it's simple math above. Whatever's flowing is just us. I mean, that's what.
Right, the calculations are just based on ours. Like I said, there's a whole lot more information.
But the Colorado.
That entire amount could actually be used by us.
That entire 75,000 acre feet would be ours.
Because of how senior our right is on the Colorado River, and at the location of this, all of that going past that point could be
To
used.
Texana.
Okay. No.
No, this
Well,
is on
then,
the
can you
Colorado.
explain that just a little bit as far as our senior water rights?
On the Colorado River?
Yeah.
We're the second most senior rights on the river.
Okay.
And the senior rights are actually upstream of us.
Okay.
Yeah, for my person, I used to always, you get bored and you look at these stream flows, and especially when you hear there's a bunch of rain up, you look up and you see where it's coming from, and like Atascosa, I think is where the big gauge number in the last couple of days. But that's because it's all ours. That's all our water, right? But when it comes to Colorado, I didn't know, because everybody has their straw in it. I just that was why you see 75,000 acre feet, and you go, yeah, but is that all, petrochemicals, water? But you're saying, no, technically it's...
Christie just highlighted that the only exception to that would be there's a right for Bay City, or right in that area, but it's a fairly small amount compared to this.
Okay, so for the most part, it's mostly ours, just for frame of reference. Okay, cool.
That is, I had no
Yeah,
idea.
belongs to the state. We bought it. We won our water. You know, there was a huge debate at the council years ago that said, why are we building this pipeline? The Colorado River's not flowing, doesn't flow. There's no water. And all the studies, I think HDR did a bunch of it, said, no, it does flow, and you can get it. I mean, even worst case scenario, 31 or 33,000 acre feet. And so now it's kind of interesting to see, now we can watch it.
75, wow.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought that up.
Well,
Yeah, actually, as of this morning's report, it's at 200,000
jeez, really?
for the month to date, yes.
200,000?
At the Colorado, yes.
Oh, my lands. We have people come here say, it's all dry, the Colorado River. I guess they don't, there's a distinction as far as on the flow. We did
Well, this is,
something
and
on
the gauge is at Wharton, so just that's the closest gauge that we found that would be representative.
But it was a gentleman who we bought the 35,000 acre feet who has the senior water rights. Who are we right under?
LCRA, yeah.
Oh, LCRA, that's right, okay. You can turn on your...
Turn on the mic, yeah.
okay.
I believe that LCRA has a right to a portion of the Garwood right, and that Corpus Christi's is, I believe, 1 day later. So it's 1 day junior to LCRA, and that diversion point is roughly at the same location.
Yeah.
But it is kind of a good index for understanding that the Bay City location where the diversion happens for Mary Roads Phase 2 it's downstream of Wharton, and LCRA does have a right there that is more senior. However, there's a good amount of flow that's coming through there, and that would kind of support some of the estimates that we had done previously that Mark was alluding to, is that during the dry times, and the Colorado water availability model was recently updated through, I believe it was 2014 or 2015, so it captured the most recent drought. And even during that time, you could get most of that 35,000
Yeah,
acre
he was
feet.
saying 30 or 31 at a worst case scenario in that drought. I'm so glad you asked that question.
Okay, and I believe now I'll turn it back over to Mark, and if there's any other questions, we'll be here to
Oh,
answer.
Mr. McGill, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Just a quick question. And return flow credit, 500, is that pretty much a static number, or is that something that
Yes,
varies over time?
That is every month, it's 500 acre feet, and it's primarily based on the return flows from the Allison wastewater treatment plant. And I did fail to mention that, though, that any deficit from a previous month has to be
You gotta
made
make
up
that
before
up.
that can be applied. But yes, no, it's a static 500 acre feet a month.
Is there anything that we can, or we're looking at in our consolidation process that can improve that number?
Mark, where'd you go?
No. So there's no other outfalls or anything like that that could produce others?
Mother Nature.
That's why I'm asking. If we strategically looked at
Well,
outfalls with,
And I know with the consolidation too, that the agreed order still has to be met with the return flow. I mean, it's not just that 500 acre feet, there's return flows to the rest of the bays and estuaries, the entire estuary. And so those still need to be met with the consolidation.
okay, so
And I'm getting outside my realm.
So the next question is, just on the line of thinking, if population growth increases, consumption increases, outfalls increase, is that factored into return flow credits in the future?
From what I understand, that could go towards being able to sell that water for reuse.
Okay.
As long as the agreed order is being met.
And is there, and on that line, is there a minimum on the return flows that we need to not touch when we sell effluent?
Yes. I think
Okay.
so.
Okay, so we've got a range to work within. We just, as we grow, we just need to be able to utilize that effluent as a revenue source to offset the cost on our wastewater going up. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay, Mark.
I am so glad we aren't doing this at 7 o'clock at night.
Yeah, I know, you have no
because
idea.
because I noticed all of you were actually, because you hadn't went through an entire day of a lot of other things, you were able to actually listen to it very closely. So
You mean we were engaged?
you were engaged.
He's politely saying you were not asleep.
Okay. The thing that I want to highlight is many of you will call me and say, "Hey, are we sending river? Is there any water going over the Calhoun Pool? Are there all kinds of questions that come to me?" And I want to tell you that I have the most difficult time finding it. I go to the Nueces River Authority website, and I click on the Pass-Thru report, and I go through and look exactly at this.
Wow.
Okay, where it says Nueces River at Cal Allen, Texas, that is the saltwater barrier. Okay, so you will see it says 0, which tells me there's no water going over the saltwater barrier. Okay, and I can also then look at how much is going through the other places. And so, like when you look at Nueces River at Tilden, is usually almost nothing. Okay, so when you see flows on these other ones, okay, you can tell whether there's water coming into the reservoirs. The other thing is notice on the left, it is hyperlinked. If you go to the actual PDF document that is on Nueces River Authority's website, and I'm going to keep plugging that, okay, you can click on that, and that will take you to the USGS website, and it will show you the flows. I believe it's just automatically gives you like the past 5 days, okay? But you can expand that range to go as far back as you want. But by just clicking on that, you can go directly to the flows that are occurring, and there's also, it will show you, like right now, there's a red line on the Nueces River. I wanted to say, go ahead.
On the Atascosa.
At the Atascosa, and then last week it was also on the Nueces River, okay, where a red line is showing that you're above flood stage. In other words, there's actually water flooding in those areas, and you'll also be able to look at that on these downstream gauges also from from Lake Corpus Christi, where you can see, are we flooding? So that's the other part of getting used to where that is and what information is. Why we've spent some time on this today is hopefully there's also others watching. If not, refer them to this to learn how to read the Pass-Thru report, because there's a lot of very useful information. It's not that I'm magical and make a lot of phone calls. Usually if I'm anywhere near a computer and I can bring up that report is how I can answer your questions so quickly and give you a pretty fair idea of what's going on.
In other words, all of you all use it too.
Pass it to other people. I mean,
Sure.
that's why it's there, is because it's a collective.
And you're saying that all of these are hyperlinks right here?
Yes, ma'am.
As far as you can click on all of those.
That's correct. And you can get, and then we'll take you to the U.S. Geological Survey's website, and you can actually see what is going on at that site as far back as you want. Okay? You can actually enter that.
Oh, how do I get out of that? How do I get out of that?
Okay.
There you go.
I'm not going to go through all these takeaways. What I want to highlight is essentially when we're managing the reservoir system, we're trying to balance 4 objectives. Okay, one is protect the integrity of the dams themselves, okay, to ensure that they're not overtopped. Okay, the last thing we want to do is lose one of the dams. So our number one priority is make sure we don't lose the dams. Number 2 is maximize the supply of water, which is an example of why we leave the water in Lake Corpus Christi, Choke Canyon as much as we can, because we want to actually open the capacity within Lake Corpus Christi. Because if you think about it, even if Choke Canyon is full and it overflows, it will go into Lake Corpus Christi. So the goal here is to maximize that. 3 is minimize flooding downstream of the reservoirs to the extent possible. And then 4 is address the health of the estuary through freshwater inflows. And finally, just a reminder, surface waters are owned by the state, and they grant us permission to use them. I think Ray alluded to, there's a lot of different reports that will say different things as far as the freshwater inflows. And we stand by for any questions.
This was very educational.
Thank you.
Mr. Scott?
Last question, when are we cutting the ribbon on phase 2? Is that next week or
No, it's
tomorrow?
It's been moved
I'm really busy
recently.
tomorrow. We could do it Thursday. No, is it coming up?
It's going to be very soon.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we're working on the actual ribbon cutting. It will be, I believe it's going to be here in September, the last I checked.
At the ON Water Stevens plant.
Right.
Yeah, it'll be here. And we'll get that information out as soon as we can when we get that final date.
Yes.
Ms. Vaughn, sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it, and this really forced me to read up on this. And the knowledge that you guys showed, I mean, I'm just impressed. I'm not going to sit up here and act like I understand all of this, because I certainly do not. And I don't know about the rest of these scholars up here. They may, but I want to understand more, because I think it's so important for this council to understand it. So, Mayor, I was just wondering if is there any way that we can do some kind of workshop in depth to study and understand this?
You know,
Unless everybody may understand it, and it just may be me.
you know what might be a good opportunity is Region N. When is the next time that you all might be having an update to your board, and maybe they can come? Or are there some opportunities that any of you all have where you'll be doing this presentation of in-depth?
Actually, yes, Bill Green intends to present it at the next, I'm sorry. Get up here, Bill.
You promised you wouldn't do that.
But then the next Region N meeting is September 8th, and then we won't meet again until January.
Mm-hmm.
So that's next week. So don't schedule the Ruby Coven for 8th. I need him.
Yeah, but also getting back to your question, that's not going to help. But maybe we can think of an opportunity to go through this again, because it was very informative.
It was.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that, Mrs. Rose. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I think among other things is there's a lot of people who I've said, well, it's just simple. All you got to do is these
No.
things, and you don't take credit. You don't look at the salinity. What we wanted to highlight today is we look at everything, okay? And we truly are trying to maximize the water supply with making sure we have the balance on those 4 objectives that I highlighted. And there sometimes there's give and take to balance those. But yes, it's very complicated, and so I still have to read over and over again for sometimes when they're telling me how something's supposed to work. So, and I've been working with this for almost 9 years. So no, ma'am, I would not think the only expert that I think may exist is Rocky. Okay, she is the one who I look to help me walk through this, but. There's not too many others that completely understand every single part of this.
Yeah. It is very complex. Mr. Garza?
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm sure you guys have looked at everything, so I know I can't come up with any better ideas, but just kind of following up on Chad's line of thinking related to being able to utilize the wastewater that we put back in for credits, or is there some areas, say for instance along the river, Nueces Bay, or a river where it's more beneficial to put the wastewater into than others?
Yeah, I think I turned my microphone on. You know, it's all about location, like all good real estate deals.
Sure.
You know, you can put water anywhere in the estuary and it helps a little, including those industrial discharges that discharge into a 45-foot deep inner harbor. That's not good habitat. You can't put enough fresh water in there to make that good habitat. Nueces Bay, if you can get it back into Nueces River, gallon for gallon in a count, if you can get it up into the delta. And the city had a project years ago to move Allison, what treated effluent, into the delta complex itself, right out into the very shallow flats, and you get a tremendous environmental benefit. For example, you may know about Suter Park over at the Oso wastewater treatment plant. What a great ecological habitat that is. A little bit of fresh water, a lot of fresh water into a very shallow area really drives the biology there. Same thing as if you could take this water and put it into the delta, into the shallow flats, into those marshes back there where the vegetation is thick. You really get a good environmental benefit from that. And the city tried to do that with the Allison wastewater plant. Unfortunately, that plant couldn't meet the ammonia treatment standards. And so, you know, there's permits involved and where
Yeah.
you discharge. So eventually, the permits were withdrawn for discharging into the delta, and the city continued to discharge into the Nueces River. So it's still good for the estuary. It's not as good as putting it over into the marshes. Perhaps when the new plants are built, they'll be built to new treatment standards. Perhaps that water quality will then be good enough to move into the delta. I'm going to take advantage here of your question, Mr. Garza, and just say, you know, I know there's a wastewater treatment consolidation. It very well could be that if the industry doesn't want that treated effluent, that water could be diverted into the Nueces River, that lower portion, not above the drinking water part, but in the lower intertidal part, or over into the delta. That would go to alleviate a lot of the low flow months. And now, not the big months. I don't want anybody to get excited here. I didn't make a deal. But in fact, you know, a gallon for gallon, that would count. You get it in the right spot, you can really make a big difference out there. I'm sure we would go back to the Nueces Estuary Advisory Council and say, let's talk about new strategies. You know, we've been in this god-awful drought for so long that, you know, these new studies and new strategies, we just haven't gotten into a comfortable position to talk about doing anything new because we're in this ugly drought. And so, having said that, I know there's other needs and demands on that treated effluent that might be a higher priority, but certainly that's a consideration that can be talked about downstream.
And I may have misunderstood your question a little bit, but we remember the minimum 54,000 acre feet that we talked about of return flows. All of the current wastewater plants, as well as the industrial returns, all of those count towards that 54,000 acre feet. So we are getting credit for our discharges everywhere they're at. Okay, it's just this 500 is specific because Allison is in the Nueces River and into the Nueces Estuary very specifically that can make impacts. Okay, but all of them we are actually getting credit for, as well as all other releases. If Portland is releasing, if everyone who's actually in the estuary system. Okay, so I may have missed the question, but I think I wanted to clarify that.
That was a question, but
Ray is always negotiating, trust me.
Yeah. Ms. Rubio?
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, on the example of the stream flows, thank you for those hyperlinks, because my husband's always checking to see, you know, the lake levels. And so this has given him an idea to where to look. So I really appreciate this particular slide. And so I like your negotiations. I like the way you're thinking. So keep thinking that way. Thank you. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Mr. McGill?
Great. Thanks for following up with that, Rudy. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking too, is if we're going through a consolidation study and we're looking at a new facility that, you know, if the new facility is treating more water in that area, then the outfall, you know, obviously you're going to want to plumb towards industry for them to purchase. But if they're not purchasing everything that we can produce right away, then they're, you know, gallon for gallon or 1,000 gallons for 1,000 gallons. I mean, if we're looking to offset the cost, and the cost of a next water supply is more than $1 per 1,000 gallons, then that's a business case to look at how can we put the treated water in the best possible place that's cost benefit to free up other municipal water supply. So that's kind of the frame of mind that I was looking at. But I see a lot of benefit in that water treatment consolidation process, integrating with the needs of the Delta, but also industry and hopefully offsetting the cost of that wastewater utility bill in the future too.
Okay, a lot of good. I used to, Bill Hennings looked at this every single morning. And no matter when we had lunch or breakfast, he could give me a report, whatever was as far. He would even go to those hyperlinks. I mean, now I know how he got that information, you know. I just think, man, this guy's a genius. Anyway, but this is really, I know, I said, God, you know everything. Anyway, but this is pretty fascinating and very helpful information. So thank you all very much.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. And LJ, welcome. You know, yeah, we're happy.